Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the second half of the Conflicting Visions of Alaska History, Alaska Historical Society's 2022 Digital Hybrid Conference. My name is Wendy Ranney. I'm a board member from Cordova, and I am here to introduce our first general topic, conflicts of colonialism and race. So today we have Adam Kirsch with us, who is a medical anthropologist and earned his doctorate in 2022 from the University of California, Davis. His doctoral research focused on the relationship between infectious diseases, settler colonialism, and racism in the Sitka. Using historic and ethnographic research methods, Adam seeks to engage academic and general audiences while working closely with communities. His funder for this research was the Runner Gren Foundation, and Adam's general topic is infectious diseases, race, and settler colonialism in the Sitka Kwáan. So Adam, if you would like to take it away, welcome back everybody, and we look forward to today's sessions. We are going to take questions after Adam's presentation. Sorry to interrupt there. So if you want to stay on when he's finished, we will take a look. There's two ways for you to ask questions. You can ask in the chat, or you can also hit the ask a question on your screen, and we will be monitoring both. So welcome back, everybody. And Adam, I look forward to your presentation.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Wendy, and thank you to the Alaska Historical Society for hosting this great conference. I'm really excited for the opportunity to get to speak with y'all. This will be a little bit longer than some of the other presentations maybe, so hang in there with me. Again, I appreciate all your presence, so thank you so much for coming today. So just want to make sure, is my screen visible?
Yes.
Great. Okay. So as Wendy said, today I'm going to be talking about infectious diseases, race, and settler colonialism on Sitka Kwáan, which is how you say Sitka and Tlingit. And so first I'm going to give a brief introduction to this presentation, talk about myself a little bit. And then before we get into this presentation, it's important to briefly discuss the history of the concept of race. And I'll get into more details about what exactly this means in a moment. So then the presentation is going to go chronologically, going to talk about infectious diseases during Russian occupation from 1799 until the Alaska Purchase, the emergence of whiteness and Russian settler colonialism, and then whiteness and infectious diseases after the Alaska Purchase before a discussion and a conclusion. And so about me, like Wendy said, I'm a medical anthropologist. I got my PhD in cultural anthropology from the University of California, Davis in June of this year. And my research has been focusing on medical anthropology. My background is also, I've been studying anthropology pretty much as soon as I started undergrad. My master's degree was also in cultural anthropology with a medical anthropology focus. And so for this project, for my dissertation research, I received funding from the Winter Gren Foundation, and I conducted fieldwork and archival research from September 2020 to September 2021. And so there's really two main components of my research, which is this historical component and the contemporary component. And today I'm only going to be discussing the historical component. But just to give you a brief overview of my methods, for the contemporary component, I engaged in participant observation and conducted interviews. Basically, participant observation is this anthropology jargon that means we both participate in an activity and observe it. So for instance, I was volunteering at vaccine clinics to help understand how people were thinking of and responding to COVID-19 vaccines and things like that. I also did just, volunteering in the community to get to know folks and things like that. And then for my historical research, I went to the Alaska State Archives in Juneau. I also looked at archival material from the National Historical Park in Sitka. And of course, looked through Library of Congress and things like that. And I briefly worked as the COVID-19 coordinator for Sitka Tribe of Alaska. And importantly, before starting all this research, I received permission to conduct research from Sitka Tribe of Alaska's Tribal Council. And if you have any questions about methods or anything like that, I'm happy to discuss that at the end. I have a long references slide as well toward the end. And so today, what I'm going to be discussing is how ideas of race were formed alongside and through the emergence of infectious diseases. And a really key beginning point for this argument is the argument that race is not a static category. So one thing that's very important to know is that the way that we understand race today is not the way that people understood race 100 years ago, and is certainly not the way that people understood race even 200 years ago. The category of race as we understand it today actually didn't come into being until about the 1850s. And I'll talk about that historical development in a moment. But the important idea here is that race does not have the same meaning in all times and places. Race acquires meaning that is specific to a time and place. So for instance, one of my mentors for my PhD was a Peruvian woman, and in Peru, she was considered a white woman, but in the United States, she's considered a woman of color. And so, though we kind of think that these ideas about race are just so naturally apparent that they must be the same everywhere, the case is that ideas about who belongs to what race and why are actually very different in different places. And so, as I said earlier, this presentation is only going to focus on the historical component of my research, just looking at infectious diseases from 1799 until roughly the 1950s. Like I said, there's a contemporary component of my research that looked at how this history manifests itself today, particularly during the first 2 years of the COVID pandemic. But today I'm only going up until about the 1950s or so. So, briefly, I just want to go through this history of the concept of race. So, as I said, the way that we understand race today is not the way that race was understood 100 years ago, or especially 200 years ago. And so, when European folks first started, for instance, coming to the Americas, they understood themselves as different from people first through the idea of religion. They didn't see themselves as necessarily white and other folks as non-white. They saw themselves as Christians and the people in the Americas as non-Christians. And so initially this difference between people that we understand to be white today was understood through language of culture and civilization and religion. So not necessarily like a biological difference, which is what the category of race really contains. And the idea of race as a biological category didn't really emerge until the mid-19th century. And basically this was when, as language and biology started to become more widespread, at this time, this is when a lot of our early ideas about biology that we use today came into being. This was still pre-germ theory, but germ theory was around this time, just a little bit later. But basically, in the mid-19th century, biologists, physical anthropologists started applying early notions of biology to existing social inequality. So it's not that they just simply observed something that occurred in nature and then wrote about it, but it was that they already had ideas about culture and they already had ideas about the world that then informed the way that they wrote about and approached those ideas. And so to briefly go through this, basically the concept of race was, very, very strongly linked with biology until about the 1950s, and basically in the aftermath of the Holocaust, when the world was starting to respond to the fact that, Nazi Germany had murdered 9 million people through ideas of biology, because they understood themselves as biologically different from Jewish folks, thus justifying the horrific acts they committed. Well, not justifying, I mean, that was their explanation for it. The world started to sort of say, okay, maybe we should take a step back from this idea that race is really neatly linked with biology. And interestingly, researchers in the 1980s and 1990s were really starting to examine whether or not racial categories corresponded to any biological reality. And what researchers found basically is that racial categories as we know them in the United States do not neatly correspond to any biological reality. This is partially because humans as a species, we actually don't have that much variation. When you compare us to other species, even other mammals, other primates, humans actually have very, very little genetic variation. And so the American Anthropological Association released a statement in the 1990s basically saying racial categories as we know them have no corresponding biological reality. And they asserted that race is instead a social reality with biological consequences. So essentially this means that, again, there's no biological basis for race, but instead race is a social category. And then this social category informs discriminatory acts, for instance, that can then have biological consequences. For instance, stress from racism in a person's day-to-day life can increase blood pressure and things like that. So the understanding is that race is a social reality with biological consequences. Additionally, scholars who have been studying race have argued that race is not only about skin color. Oftentimes, especially in the United States, when we think about race, we think only about skin color. But scholars who have studied race have demonstrated that it's not just about skin color. It includes ideas about culture, education, and language. You know, and certainly everyone at some point has commented on the fact that someone who is categorized as another racial group than themselves might even have the same skin tone as themselves. But again, people are put into different racial categories. But what's important to understand here is that race acquires meaning not just through skin color, but through all of these social and cultural phenomena like culture, education, language, how a person speaks. And that's what really informs how a person is placed into a different racial category. And so historian Stuart Hall argued that race is a floating signifier. This gets into some kind of tricky linguistic stuff, but more or less this basically means that race as a category is specific to time and place. As I mentioned earlier, one of my mentors during my PhD is from Peru. In Peru, she's considered a white woman. In the United States, she's considered a woman of color. And it's not that, you know, her skin tone magically changes when she gets on a plane from Peru to the United States. It's that there are different social circumstances that mean that she's categorized in different racial groups depending on where she is. And so the reason that I'm bringing all of this up is because what I'm going to be arguing in this presentation is basically that how folks in Sitka understood what it means to be white was determined through ideas that they had about infectious diseases. And so essentially, you know, I mentioned here race includes ideas about culture and education, language. And what I'm arguing here is that these ideas about who belongs to what race also include ideas about infectious diseases. And so I'm going to begin with around 1799 when the Russians first arrived in Sitka. And to give some brief historical context, essentially Russia had been steadily expanding eastward for several hundred years into Siberia. And this was, you know, for a variety of reasons, one of which was to expand the Russian fur trade. And while the Russians had moved eastward, essentially they had been enslaving and exploiting indigenous Siberians as they moved eastward in order to get as many furs as possible to fill imperial Russian coffers. The revenue from fur sales was actually a really significant portion of imperial Russian funding, imperial Russian money for quite a long time. And so essentially Russian fur traders had taken this practice and steadily moved it eastward through Siberia, and then eventually also moved this practice into Alaska. For instance, when the Russians first came to the Aleutian Islands, they enslaved Unangak people and forced them basically to catch more furs to catch more animals to get furs to make more money for the Russian government. And of course, when the Russians came to Sitka in 1799, they brought numerous infectious diseases that had not previously been in Sitka. Some, such as smallpox, came before 1799 from other European traders who had come into Southeast Alaska. But for the most part, it's safe to say that since the Russians were having a prolonged and extended presence in Sitka, they were bringing numerous infectious diseases. And so the sources for understanding how Russians perceived these infectious diseases at the time come from three Russian physicians who were Eduardus Blaschka, Dr. Romanovsky, and Dr. Frankenhauser, as well as colonial administrators such as Pavel Mikhailovich Golovin, I spelled that wrong, and Ivan Veniaminov, who were writing about infectious diseases. So as both these physicians and these different colonial administrators were noticing that infectious diseases were both more prevalent and more deadly among Tlingit folks in Sitka, they were basically writing, what they thought to be the reason for this. And this gives us a really significant amount of insight into what they were thinking and how they were understanding infectious diseases through ideas about cultural difference and later racial difference. And so essentially when the Russians arrived in Sitka, they saw the prevalence and persistence of infectious diseases among Tlingit folks as being a result of cultural differences. So for instance, the Russian physicians and colonial officials wrote, for example, that infectious diseases were present because of Tlingit folks' housing. But then when you continue to read on, you see the physicians and administrators note, well, actually, the Tlingit housing was very similar to the Russian housing, contradicting themselves in their argument. And so what they were essentially arguing was that cultural difference itself was the reason for this presence of infectious disease. Basically, the Russians wrote about themselves as being civilizationally superior. They saw themselves as more, quote unquote, developed. This language still persists today, but it's very important to note that these ideas of one culture being more developed than another are actually very thoroughly debunked within the field of anthropology and within among academic historians for the most part. And so, Russian colonial administrators and physicians are writing, there are these housing differences, there's differences in the foods that people are eating. And they were essentially saying that these were the reasons that infectious diseases were more prevalent and more deadly among Tlingit folks. And so, in a way, these infectious diseases themselves became a marker for difference. That is, if there was a larger presence of infectious disease among a particular group of people, they argued that this was because of differences between the two of them. And through these arguments, the Russians argued that those who had more infectious diseases were inferior. And I have this picture here, which is a lithograph that Tsar Nicholas II commissioned in 1826 to basically draw a little bit of attention to this. So if you look at this picture, you can actually see some of the things that Russian physicians and Russian colonial administrators were writing about. One of the first things that sticks out to me in this picture is these kind of distorted faces, right? Some of these lithographs are very, very realist, of course, right? Because the purpose of these lithographs was to sort of create knowledge for Imperial Russia about their new territories. But we can see some of these faces, just the proportions are a little bit strange, especially when you compare them alongside other lithographs. And then Russian physicians and colonial administrators, again, they wrote that Tlingit homes, they perceived Tlingit homes to be dirty, but again would note Russian homes in Sitka were actually pretty much the same. And so this lithograph, instead of just being like a simple realist interpretation of the world, actually gives us more insight into what Europeans in Sitka were focusing on at the time and the things that they perceived to be worthy of recording through these lithographs. And so colonial administrators such as Tikhmanev wrote that the spread of smallpox during a particularly large outbreak of smallpox in the 1830s, Tikhmanev argued that this was, quote, due to the style of life of the habits of the Aleuts and Kolosh, which respectively means the Unangach and the Tlingit, which greatly aided the transmission of disease from one victim to another. Stuffy and often remarkably untidy dwellings, filthy clothing, and intemperance in diet persisted despite the colonial administration's admonitions and efforts, unquote. And the last sentence fragment, the last clause in this is really what I think is incredibly important, because he says, despite the colonial administration's admonitions and efforts. So essentially what Tikhmanev is arguing is that there were more diseases among Alaska Native people because Alaska Native people wouldn't listen to the Russian colonial administration, because they wouldn't behave as Russians were behaving. It's also important to note sort of the absurdity of a couple of these statements. For instance, it's not in this quote specifically, but in this quote, Tikhmanev is mentioning the filthy clothing. There were multiple Russian authors at the time who were saying, they were basically criticizing the way that Tlingit people were dressing in Sitka. And again, I want to draw attention to the absurdity of this, because Tlingit people have been living in Southeast Alaska since time immemorial. And so certainly they know how to dress themselves. And really the truth of the matter would be that Russians didn't know how to dress themselves in Sitka. As a matter of fact, Russians were actually very deeply dependent upon Tlingit people for their survival in Sitka. They wrote about this extensively in their colonial records and even complained about this extensively, saying basically that they couldn't survive without trade from the Tlingit people. But nonetheless, the Russians were still writing about themselves as being inherently superior, assuming themselves to really know better than the Tlingit people. And before one can sort of before one can get any ideas about, medical knowledge, it's important to note at the time of this writing, the dominant theory of medicine was not germ theory. It was miasmic theory, which basically means that rather than seeing diseases as a result of germs, they saw diseases as a result of winds blowing in from particular directions that would make a person disease. So it's not like, they were even understanding infectious diseases through language that's familiar to us today. This was an understanding of infectious diseases that absolutely is not accepted in any way, shape, or form in the biomedical community. And so the Russian physician Eduard Splashka wrote, quote, diseases particular to the Koloshi, the Tlingit, are indurated from their way of life, staying almost constantly in the open air, almost naked of head and body or badly clothed, especially in the winter from succession of daily sea baths. And so again, this is essentially a Russian physician saying, these diseases that we're seeing are because they aren't behaving in a way that we consider to be socially acceptable. Essentially saying these diseases are happening because Tlingit people are different from Russian people. And so, we have this statement, almost naked of head and body or badly clothed. Again, Tlingit people have been living in Sitka since time immemorial and certainly know how to dress themselves in Sitka. And this last clause was borderline amusing to me, because he's saying, one of the problems is these daily sea baths, is this habit of bathing themselves on a daily basis. And at the time, Blashka was essentially saying, this is why there are more diseases among Tlingit people. And so hopefully through explaining some of these quotes, you can see some of the contradiction that's inherent in these statements. And you can also see sort of some of the inconsistent reasoning that shows that, we can't take these quotes at face value. We can't just see what Russian colonial administrators or physicians have written and assume that they were writing an unbiased account of events. We have to understand that they were writing within a particular historical, social, and cultural context, and they themselves had biases. And so these Russians initially understood these differences between themselves and the Tlingit through, again, this language of culture and civilization, and sometimes through the language of religion. There's a very interesting discussion to be had on the differences between Russian Orthodox tolerance of Tlingit spiritual practices versus, Euro-American Protestants' tolerance of Tlingit religious practices. The Dauenhauers have written on this extensively. Sergei Kahn has also written on this, and I encourage you to read that for more information on that, but it's a bit outside the scope of this. But in any case, when the Russians were writing about this in the 1820s, 30s, and 40s, the idea of race as we know it today actually had not yet taken hold in Europe. Through the late 1840s and the early 1950s, the idea that people were biologically different from one another in a way that could be measured in racial categories started to spread across Europe. And as these ideas started to spread, more and more physicians were reading this, more and more scholars at the time were reading this. And so we see this same language about biologically based racial difference start to come into Russian physicians' writings. And so before, where Russian physicians and colonial administrators would write about cultural differences, two Russian physicians, Dr. Romanovsky and Dr. Frankenhauser, in the 1850s, started to attribute these differences to breed and blood. So rather than saying these are cultural differences, they're starting to say that these are biological differences. And it's very important to note that right at this time, when they're starting to describe these differences through this more familiar language of biologically based racial difference, rather than just writing themselves as Russian, they begin to describe themselves as white and European. And again, I think noting the timing of this is very, very important. Before this language about breed and blood came to their writing, these Russian colonial administrators did not describe themselves as white or European. They simply described themselves as Russian. But again, once they started to use this language of biologically based racial difference, then they started to describe themselves as white and European. And so this is really the beginning of the formation of racial categories as we know it today, and thus the beginning of the formation of the notion of whiteness, the notion of understanding the difference of people of European ancestry as different from other peoples of the world through phenotypic difference, through difference in physical appearances and categorizing those physical appearances as white versus, at the time they wrote just native or other folks. And right around this time, when these doctors are starting to write about these these differences through the language of breed and blood, Pavel Mikhailovich Golovin wrote, quote, "It is an incontrovertible fact that when savage people come into contact with civilized people, they gradually die out. Wherever white men go, the native population rapidly decreases," end quote. And this quote really encapsulates how this language of cultural difference began to be meshed with this language about biological difference. So first, he's sort of discussing difference between Russians and Tlingit people through notions about culture. He's saying savage versus civilized people. And this quote is essentially arguing that what causes fatalities and diseases, or fatalities from infectious diseases, is this contact between who he describes as savage and who he describes as civilized people. And then in the next sentence, he describes the people he perceives to be civilized as white. And he says, wherever white men go, the native population rapidly decreases. And what's very important to note here is that Golovin is understanding massive fatalities from infectious diseases and from settler colonialism, not as the result of a social or historical process like the expansion of colonialism, but instead he naturalizes this. He understands this as something that is just supposed to happen. And so this is really the weaponization of these ideas of biological difference. And he's basically saying that genocidal death is a quote unquote natural thing. And so again, this is a place where we can criticize or critique this and draw attention to how these ideas of racial categories began to be understood through ideas of infectious diseases. Because in this statement, he's also basically saying people who die from infectious diseases at a large scale are quote unquote savage, and people who do not die from infectious diseases at such a large scale are quote unquote white and quote unquote civilized. And so again, the way that he is understanding what whiteness is articulated through notions of infectious diseases. And so, as I've said, the language of civilizational difference meshed with language of biological superiority and inferiority. And at this point, infectious diseases like tuberculosis and smallpox became a marker not just for cultural difference, but Russian colonial administrators and physicians were writing of infectious diseases as a marker of biological difference that then defined racialized populations. Because again, it's important to note that these, Russians were understanding themselves as different from Tlingit people when they arrived, but were not understanding that difference through the language of biology at this point. And they certainly weren't understanding that difference through the lens of race as we might see it today. And so this is really the beginning of the formation of these ideas about who belongs to what race in Sitka. And so, in 1867, there was the Alaska Purchase, and there was a transition between Russian colonial occupation and Euro-American colonial occupation. And so while there are some similarities between how the Russians and Euro-Americans behaved, there are also some differences. Like the Russians, the Euro-Americans assumed themselves to be racially and culturally superior to Tlingit people in Sitka. So at this point, this early racial science, which today is considered pseudoscience, was widespread enough that basically the Euro-Americans who came into Sitka already had these very entrenched ideas about racial difference through the language of biology. And like the Russians, again, they understood themselves, they assumed themselves to be culturally and civilizationally superior to Tlingit people. But there are some major differences in how Euro-Americans and how Russians responded to this cultural difference. For instance, Russians, especially the Russian Orthodox Church, were much more willing to tolerate differences in spiritual practices and willing to sort of incorporate those differences in spiritual practices into the practice of Russian Orthodoxy. Whereas when Protestants, specifically Presbyterians, began to come to Sitka, they wanted to completely eliminate the Tlingit language. They wanted to completely eliminate all Tlingit culture and basically to force Tlingit people to completely and totally assimilate. Whereas the Russians were still pushing for assimilation, but not on the scale that the Presbyterians were pushing. And again, the Russians regularly lamented that they were very much dependent upon Tlingit people for trade and for their survival in Sitka. But obviously, Euro-Americans did not face the same logistical challenges that the Russians faced because Euro-Americans were much closer to the rest of their territory and the rest of their supplies and things like that, while the Russians were, worlds away from St. Petersburg. And so there's somewhat of a difference in the response to Tlingit people just based on this. And so, as I said, Euro-American efforts to, instead of misionize, this is supposed to be missionize, Euro-American efforts to missionize and assimilate Tlingit people were much harsher and more widespread than the Russians. And so, as I said, Euro-Americans maintained this language of biological superiority. They understood themselves as white people to be biologically superior to Tlingit folks and Alaska Natives generally. And this racist perspective is easily visible in basically any colonial correspondences or any governmental correspondences from the territorial governor, from the records of naval officers, army officers, and even, folks, for instance, I have Dr. William Ramsey of the Alaska Board of Education. He wrote that Alaska Natives were, quote, a primitive race, and wrote that they, quote, have less resistance, unquote, than whites. So again, William Ramsey was taking the same idea that I mentioned earlier from a Russian colonial administrator, essentially saying that Alaska Native folks are dying from infectious diseases more because they're Alaska Native, rather than understanding the fact that Euro-Americans and Russians were bringing numerous diseases into Southeast Alaska that actually had not existed there before. And so again, infectious diseases become this really important matrix for their understanding of who is white and who is not white. And this difference in prevalence and severity of infectious diseases was regularly noted, regularly remarked upon. And missionaries such as Sheldon Jackson actually in part justified the creation of the Alaska Native boarding school system through ideas about infectious diseases. Sheldon Jackson and other Presbyterian missionaries basically wrote that more Alaska Natives were dying of infectious diseases because they assumed, or because, sorry, these missionaries were writing that Alaska Natives were dying more from infectious diseases because these missionaries believed that Alaska Natives were not practicing proper hygienic practices. And therefore, they said, because they're not learning how to, quote unquote, be hygienic at home, they should be taken from their families and forcibly removed from their families and forced to stop speaking their language and stop practicing their culture. And in addition to, forcibly separating these families, which has had horrific repercussions to this day that we still have not fully grappled with as a country, Presbyterian missionaries at this time forcibly removed Tlingit people from their homes to place them in, quote unquote, Victorian-style homes under the assumption that these homes were both morally superior. They wrote that this Victorian-style housing was going to properly implement good Christian morality. But they also wrote that these homes were less likely to facilitate the spread of infectious diseases. And so these two acts here, both sending Alaska Native children to boarding schools and in basically breaking apart the traditional social and home structure of Tlingit people in Sitka, are, again, this mass forced assimilation and this massive effort to basically completely and totally change Tlingit people's lives, in large part through justification about infectious diseases, through language of infectious diseases. And again, I'm not presenting these to say that this is, an objective account. I'm doing the absolute opposite, which is to try and contextualize their arguments socially and culturally to understand how they were making this argument. And so to the left here, we can actually see some of the Sheldon Jackson cottages in Sitka. And so again, these were the quote unquote Victorian homes that were supposed to be so much better than traditional Tlingit homes. And these are the homes that they forcibly moved Tlingit people into. And this was not even the entirety of the racialized ways that colonial administrators were responding to outbreaks of infectious diseases. One very common practice was racially segregated quarantines. So for instance, shortly after the Alaska Purchase, when Captain Lester Beardsley was essentially the head governing officer of the territory of Alaska, there was a typhus outbreak in Sitka. And so once this typhus outbreak began, Captain Lester Beardsley told whites to quarantine, said all the white folks should stay home, but all the Tlingit people have to continue to work. And so essentially, Captain Beardsley was saying Tlingit people have to continue to be exposed to infectious diseases while white people do not. And so again, Captain Beardsley was basically saying, I'm going to protect the lives of white folks in Sitka, and I am not going to protect the lives of Tlingit folks in Sitka. And this practice continued. During a smallpox outbreak in 1901, Territorial Governor John Brady made Tlingit people suspected of having smallpox. This was both people who had actual symptoms of smallpox and people who they thought might be a close contact of someone with smallpox. They made them quarantine on Yakwakasha, which is Japonski Island. And notably, there was no such requirement for whites. Governor Brady did not say any white folks who have symptoms of smallpox or who are suspected of being a contact of someone with smallpox have to go to this other place. Only Tlingit people who are suspected of this have to be isolated. And on Japonski Island, Yakwakasha, there was not adequate access to water. There was not adequate access to food. When the Tlingit people quarantined on the island, tried to even trade with stores in downtown Sitka, they weren't allowed to trade. They weren't allowed to try and get more food or water. And so a lot of the people who were quarantined actually died of exposure rather than smallpox. And so this racially segregated quarantine in itself killed people. And around Southeast Alaska, this really continued. In Cake, for instance, there was an outbreak of influenza, and officials there said that only the Tlingit people needed to quarantine. And there's some discussion through government cables sent back and forth through each other with them asking, is it legal for us to force people to quarantine? And essentially what these government communications said was, it's legal for us to force Tlingit people to quarantine, but it's not legal for us to force white people to quarantine. And so again, just very directly there, that is saying that a different set of laws apply to white people than apply to Tlingit people. And again, this is effectively saying that, they were treating them differently and understanding them as different through these ideas of infectious diseases. And essentially here, what we see both in these acts and in government communications is that Alaskan, territorial, and later state administrators assumed that Tlingit and other Alaska Native people just inherently carried more infectious diseases, which again, this is completely eliminating this very important historical and social context for why these prevalences of infectious diseases were different among these populations. And so their understanding of who was white and who was not continued to be formed through these ideas of infectious diseases. And this also even leaked into the politics of seeking aid during outbreaks of infectious diseases. So during the 1919 flu pandemic, Territorial Governor Riggs wrote to the Red Cross to request funding. And he has this very chilling quote here. He said, quote, "If influenza does break out, I shall be obliged to let the natives die," unquote. And so again, he was writing to the Red Cross to ask for more funding to respond to the flu pandemic. But he didn't say, if influenza breaks out, I shall be obliged to let all folks in Alaska die. I shall be obliged to let white folks in Alaska die. He specifically says, I shall be obliged to let the natives die, which essentially shows that he was not willing to commit the same resources to white folks as to Alaska natives. That basically he was saying, you know, with the money that I have, you know, we will protect white folks. This is by implication. This is not directly what he said. But if I don't receive more funding, Alaska Native folks are going to die. And what was also interesting in his letter was when he's trying to encourage the Red Cross to send funding, one of the main things that he starts to emphasize is the territory's high rate of military service, the fact that white Alaskans donated per capita more to the Red Cross than folks in the lower 48. Well, not 48 at the time, right? But the continental US, or contiguous US, excuse me. And so basically he was saying that these supposed virtues were the reasons that the Red Cross should send money rather than just inherently responding to a humanitarian crisis. And so eventually the Red Cross did give this funding to Alaska, but a lot of this funding actually didn't reach Alaska Natives, including funding that was specifically earmarked for widows and orphans. The husband of Elizabeth Paratovich, Roy Paratovich, actually wrote a letter to the territorial governor at the time, basically asking for an explanation, saying, you received this money that was specifically supposed to go to widows and women who were widowed and children who were orphaned as a result of infectious diseases. But that money has never reached Alaska Native folks, and asking for an explanation. And so again, these infectious diseases continued to function as a marker of racial difference. And again, I'm not saying that biologically this happened, I'm saying that socially this happened. That colonial administrators assumed that people who were Alaska Native were just inherently more likely to contract infectious diseases, rather than, again, understanding the social, cultural, and historical context of this. And so through this, they were arguing that populations that had higher rates of infectious diseases were non-white, specifically Alaska Native, while saying that people who had less occurrence of infectious diseases were marked as quote unquote white. And this continued into the tuberculosis epidemic in Alaska. And so as tuberculosis spread across the state, Governor Gröning wrote to the Federal Security Administration to request funding to respond to the outbreak of tuberculosis. And he specifically in this letter writes that if he didn't receive money to help combat tuberculosis in Alaska Native villages, then whites would become more infected, thus compromising national security. And so again, he's not saying, give me money to help combat the tuberculosis epidemic because we should, because they're human beings. He's saying, give me this money because if you don't give it to me, more white people are going to get sick, and then our national security is going to be compromised. And of course, he's writing this in the context of the Cold War, right? So there's rumblings then, as there are today, about, you know, worrying about American versus Russian military presence in Alaska and in the Arctic. And so, again, these ideas of infectious diseases marked whites and Alaska Natives as different populations that deserve different levels of attention. And again, I want to emphasize that I'm not saying that this is because of any biological difference. I'm saying this is how these categories became socially constructed. And to the left here, we have a picture of Governor Gröning signing the 1945 Anti-Discrimination Bill, Anti-Discrimination Act, excuse me, with Elizabeth and Roy Paratovich. Elizabeth Paratovich is to the left of Governor Gröning and Roy Paratovich is on the far right. And again, Roy Paratovich was the one who was asking why this infectious disease aid for widows and orphans was not reaching Alaska Natives, despite the fact that it was supposed to be for Alaska Natives. And while I've been discussing this history, a common critique from Native American and indigenous studies is that researchers, specifically white researchers who have been discussing indigenous peoples, have a tendency to only discuss the negative things and to only depict Alaska Native folks as, a passively suffering population. And that is not my intention here at all. My intention is to draw attention to the way that whiteness comes into being, particularly in relation to these infectious disease categories, on the one hand for an academic understanding, but more importantly to seek accountability for these actions that today we understand to be quite racist. And I also wanted to take a moment to highlight resilience in the face of infectious diseases because, it takes an incredible amount of strength to continue to endure through all of these genocidal efforts. And while I was doing this research, I was trying to also look at Tlingit history, Tlingit life histories, a lot of which are collected in the really wonderful works of the Downhowers. And one of the folks they spoke with, Shakakuni, whose English name was Judson Brown, was living during the flu pandemic in the early 1900s. And he wrote that the flu pandemic was a difficult time for many Tlingit people, but young people's energy and the activities of the Alaska Native Brotherhood and the Alaska Native Sisterhood helped him to have hope during this really dark time. And I mentioned these racially motivated these racially segregated quarantines that were happening during the flu pandemic. And the Alaska Native Brotherhood was actually one of the organizations that was trying to seek an explanation from the government saying, why are you only enforcing, or why are you only forcing Tlingit people to quarantine? Why are you only focusing Tlingit people to quarantine? Why aren't you asking white people to quarantine? And why, please justify this violation of our civil rights, essentially. And at the same time, Elizabeth Paratovich worked to end legal housing segregation in Alaska. And this might seem tangential, but through explaining how Presbyterian missionaries forced Tlingit folks and Sitka and really Alaska Native folks around the state out of their traditional homes into quote unquote Victorian style homes, we can really see that Elizabeth Paratovich trying to advocate for equity in this case is also something that is sort of pushing back against infectious diseases. And additionally, in 2021, Alaska was, at least in the first half of the year, Alaska was really a great success story in terms of vaccination rates. Alaska was one of the most vaccinated states for COVID-19 in the entire country. And this was really largely due to the activities of Alaska Native regional health consortiums in Southeast Alaska. That's the Southeast Alaska Regional Health Consortium, SEARCH, who, distributed vaccines that were earmarked for Alaska Native folks to white folks. In Sitka, SEARCH was, where I got vaccinated and where a lot of people were able to get vaccinated much quicker than people I knew and others knew in the lower 48 were able to get vaccinated. And so really, these Alaska Native health consortiums are the main reason that Alaska was such a great success story in the first half of the pandemic. And additionally, while I was working and living in Sitka, even before I was working for Sitka Tribe of Alaska, I just heard over and over again from tribal citizens that they were so grateful for the services and the aid that Sitka Tribe of Alaska offered to their tribal citizens. And it was a very stark contrast to the aid that other governments were offering, which was much less. And so before I end, I am going to bring in some brief discussion of theory here. And my approach in this is influenced by French philosopher Michel Foucault, who wrote about this thing that he called biopolitics. And Foucault essentially wrote that biopolitics deal with the way that the state attempts to exert control over the bodies of a population in the name of public health. And so biopolitics is essentially the process through which, again, the state is telling people how to manage their bodies in the name of public health. And this is not inherently a negative thing, but it can obviously be utilized in very, very negative ways. And these ideas about what health actually looks like and who is considered healthy and who is considered unhealthy heavily intersect with ideas about race, gender, and class. So again, this is just to point out that the idea of health is also culturally and temporally specific rather than just sort of a natural static category. And Goempel scholar Eileen Morden Robinson brought in this idea of biopolitics to understand whiteness in relation to Aboriginal Australians. And she wrote that biopolitics provides context for how, quote, whiteness operates through the racialized application of disciplinary knowledge and regulatory mechanisms which function together to preclude recognition of indigenous sovereignty, unquote. More or less, she's saying that the structures of disciplinary knowledge, here she's referring to medicine, that ideas from medicine are informed by cultural biases and cultural perspectives and racialized biases that then inform the way the government functions. And those two things work together to basically preclude recognition of indigenous sovereignty. And so when we apply these ideas of biopolitics to examining how the notion of whiteness was created alongside and through infectious diseases, we see how colonizers exerted hierarchical difference through the application of medical knowledge. And this created and marked whites and Tlingit people as hierarchically distinct populations. And so in conclusion, just to sum this up real quick, when Russian colonizers arrived, they saw infectious diseases as a crucial a crucial matrix for colonizers' efforts to mark differences between themselves and Tlingit people and Sitka. And again, initially they understood this through the language of civilization and culture. But as what's now considered pseudoscience, but as the ideas about race started to acquire biological markers and were exercised through language of biological difference, these ideas of different populations accumulated, biological characteristics. And so rather than Russians just saying that they were civilizationally or culturally superior, they start to describe themselves as white and start to say that they are racially superior. And after the Alaska Purchase, Euro-American colonizers continued to mark Tlingit people as racially different through these ideas about infectious diseases. And so consequently, in this presentation, I've argued that infectious diseases have been a crucial matrix through which Russian and Euro-American colonizers created populational difference. And this creation of populational difference through ideas about infectious diseases, through ideas of medicine, are really an application of biopolitics as described by Foucault and Eileen Morden Robinson, as I mentioned in the last slide. Here's a list of references that I have. Happy to pass that on to anyone who would like. And thank you so much for your attention. I know that's been a long presentation, and I really appreciate your attention through this. And now I'm looking forward to talking with y'all. And cool, thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Let me get back on here. I'm not sure if everyone can see me or not. But we do have a question in the chat. I don't know, Adam, if you can see that from Rachel.
Yes.
If you could address that for us, please.
Absolutely. And yeah, Rachel, that's a great question. So I guess for the recording, I'll read the question. It says, Rachel asked, can you talk about how ideas of race and infectious diseases applied to mixed race individuals in Sitka was there a Creole class among Tlingits as occurred in Subpiaq and Unungach areas of the Russian colony? So this is a great question, and the answer is yes. So essentially, the folks who got brought to Sitka that were classified as Creole people were folks who were mixed ancestry of Russian and Unungach or Russian and Subpiaq. And the people who were marked as Creole that were brought to Sitka were a lot of times either employed by the Russian American company or were essentially enslaved by the Russian American company to do work. And one of the things that the Russian American company did was forced Creole folks to get vaccinated against smallpox. And so actually during the really horrific smallpox outbreak in Sitka in 1835, one of the things that Tlingit people at the time noticed was that the Creole folks were also not as affected by smallpox as Tlingit people were. And again, this was because the Russians were forcing Creole folks to get vaccinated. And so similarly, let's see. This really also resulted in the creation of a racialized hierarchy that kept Russian folks at the top. And there was even a distinction between people of Russian ancestry who were born in Russia and people of Russian ancestry who were born in the colonies, with people of Russian ancestry being born in the colonies being hierarchically lower than people of Russian ancestry born in Russia. And Creole folks were considered by the Russians to be hierarchically above Alaska Native folks, but hierarchically below Russian folks. And there's actually, at the same time as these doctors are writing about the language of breed and blood, one of the things that they write about is, I can't remember if it was Blaschka or if it was Romanovsky and Frankenhauser, but one of those doctors was writing that basically he was saying that he thought people being of mixed race would result in a quote unquote improvement of the stock. Basically saying that he thought that Creole folks would be superior to people who are only ancestrally Alaska Native. And so, yeah, does that answer your question, Rachel? I'm sorry, I meandered a little bit there.
We have another question. We're waiting to see if that answers Rachel's. We have another question coming in. It's actually, I'm going to read it from the question area from Shayna. I have two questions and comments. First, in the Russian colony, did the idea of whites replacing other races reflect Russian imperial experiences in Eurasia? And second, can you riff on more recent medical ideas about human diversity shaped by advancing knowledge of genetics and epigenetics?
Awesome. Thanks, Wendy. And thanks for the question, Shayna. Awesome. I'm glad it answers it, Rachel. Okay. So, while Russians were expanding eastward into Siberia and across Eurasia, it's important to note that at that time, the Russians weren't understanding themselves as white at this point. They understood themselves as Russian, essentially, because Russian historical identity is unique in Europe in the sense that Western Europeans didn't often think of Russians as quote unquote Europeans. They thought of them as more Eastern, and some Western Europeans were essentially prejudiced towards Russians because they perceived Russians to be more quote unquote Central Asian or more Asian than Western Europeans. And so as Russians were moving across Siberia further and further eastward, they again had a unique historical identity that was European, but not quite European, right? Because they still understood themselves as different from Western Europeans. And again, at that time, the idea of whiteness and the idea of, racial difference had not yet come into being. This was mostly, again, through ideas about civilization and cultural difference rather than racial difference. And that language about racial difference didn't really come into existence until around the 1850s. And so to answer your question, these ideas about cultural and racial differences were created and perpetuated as Russians expanded eastward. And then later, once Russians were in Alaska, this language of race and biological difference began to mesh with this pre-existing language about cultural and civilizational difference. And second, this is a really great question about genetics and epigenetics. And so honestly, epigenetics is a really fascinating area. I'm not an epigeneticist. I'm not, I'm a cultural and medical anthropologist. I'm not a physical anthropologist. And so I'm speaking from this with a limited understanding. And so epigenetics is actually this really, really fascinating place because what essentially epigenetics has demonstrated is that all of our DNA is not expressed at a particular point in time. All of the DNA that we inherit, some things will be sort of activated depending on environmental factors. So there are parts of your DNA that don't manifest until there's some sort of environmental trigger. And this has really allowed us to come to a better understanding of things like intergenerational trauma, because being traumatized can change the way that your DNA expresses itself. And if you are traumatized, because your DNA it doesn't happen in every circumstance. There are some people who go through traumatic events who don't manifest these epigenetic markers, but other people go through traumatic events and do have these epigenetic markers. And then those genetic markers can be inherited. So for instance, people who experience PTSD, for example, their children are more likely to also have PTSD if they ever go through a traumatic event, or are more likely to have depression or anxiety or things like this. And to me, what this really demonstrates is a point that I made earlier in the presentation, which was saying that race is a social idea that has biological consequences. And so, again, race as we know it doesn't have a biological reality. It's more helpful to understand human populations through notions of ancestry than notions of race, partially because, right, there is never a place where there's a very neat dividing line between different human populations. It's very difficult to point to particular genetic markers and say, this person is absolutely 100% from this race, and this other person is absolutely 100% from this other race. And if you ever do, one of those modern DNA tests, if you read the fine print, there's some mention in there that basically the information that they're giving you is sort of a product for entertainment rather than something that's like really scientifically valid. It's not something that would be published in paper. But epigenetics really shows us how social and environmental circumstances can change the way that our DNA expresses itself, can change the way that then future generations inherit DNA. And so this really shows us that the social ideas of difference and the results of these ideas through racialized oppression can have biological consequences. And this is not quite touching on epigenetics, but this is just sort of an example that hopefully is helpful and not just me rambling. But for instance, for a really long time, medical literature would tell healthcare professionals that Black folks have generally speaking, Black folks have higher blood pressure than white folks. And for a while, medical literature was saying this is because of some biological difference. But more recent research has showed that this actually isn't the result of a biological difference between people who are marked as Black and people who are marked as white. This is actually a result of stressors and pressure in society from racism that then makes a person's blood pressure higher. And so hopefully that answers your question. But long story short, I think epigenetics is a really fascinating place for, again, showing the recursive and interactive relationship between biology and culture. Hopefully that answers your question, Shayna.
Thanks, Adam. I don't see any other questions. I did just want to comment how interesting I find this. I live in a cannery that we have repurposed. It's only ever been a cannery and our adventure lodge. And in the winter, we do some deep diving and research into the cultural aspects of the community here. Through cultural resource surveys and personal correspondence, you know, we've discovered just how deep the segregation went here. 1896, we had kind of a 60-40 population of Native versus Chinese workers. And then the Chinese population took over until the 1900s, when most of them actually were lost to an epidemic. And then we're finding personal correspondence that these workers were promised that if they would die here, their personal belongings and bodies would actually be shipped back to China to be buried with their families. And we found that that actually didn't happen. And due to the fact that they died of an epidemic. And so we're in the process of doing surveys on the property to try to figure out where they were buried, because it was very segregated. They didn't eat with the whites, they didn't sleep or live with the whites, and most of them are not marked in where they're buried on the property. So the whole segregation issue and that time period is very interesting. We thank you very much for bringing this to us. This was super fascinating. I'd love to talk to you more about this in the future. And I appreciate everybody chiming in and the questions. Thank you again, Adam. And we will take a break. We'll be back at 11. I believe next on the schedule is a workshop preserving paper documents and photographs on a shoestring budget with Rachel. I believe that's the next up for today. And I appreciate everybody. Have a great day, and we'll see you after coffee.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Wendy. Really appreciate it.